Hey guys, tonight we are doing one of those stories that feels heavy, strange, and quietly exhausting in the best possible way for falling asleep. So dim the lights, put your phone down somewhere safe, and let your brain slowly clock out for the evening. Tonight we are not talking about dramatic trials or fiery endings or courtroom speeches. We are backing up, way back, to the part nobody really lingered on. The part before the trial even started, before any evidence was presented, before anyone asked an actual question. We are talking about what happened to women accused of witchcraft before they ever stepped into a courtroom. The waiting, the holding, the slow grind of suspicion, the deeply unpleasant logistics of being labeled a problem in a world that did not enjoy paperwork, but loved punishment. This is going to be calm, a little bleak, slightly sarcastic, and very, very slow. Perfect bedtime material. So, let us ease into it. In medieval and early modern Europe, witchcraft accusations rarely arrived with urgency. This was not a dramatic knock at the door followed by instant justice. It was usually much duller. A neighbor complained. Someone's cow died. A baby failed to thrive. Milk curdled. Bread collapsed. The vibes were off. And slowly, quietly, a woman's name began to circulate. At first, nothing official happened. That came later. What happened first was social evaporation. Once a woman was suspected of witchcraft, her life began shrinking. People stopped visiting. Markets became colder. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room. Children were pulled indoors. Eye contact became rare. She had not been charged with anything, but she was already being punished. This period could last weeks, months, sometimes years. Entire lifetimes passed under suspicion without any formal action, which sounds merciful until you realize it meant constant surveillance without resolution. No closure, just pressure. Eventually, someone important noticed. A priest, a magistrate, a landowner with time on his hands. And then things became official. The first step was not a trial, it was detention. And detention did not mean a neat little cell with a cot and some water. It meant being removed from your home, usually without warning, and placed somewhere unpleasant, but convenient. Sometimes this was a town jail, sometimes a castle basement, sometimes a private house converted into a holding space, sometimes just a locked room in a civic building that smelled like damp wool and old despair. Women were rarely told how long they would be held, or why, or what came next. And no, they were not gently escorted. Arrests were abrupt, public, designed to signal control. A woman might be seized while cooking, while tending animals, while attending church, because nothing says spiritual authority like dragging someone out of a pew. Personal belongings were left behind. Children were left behind. Livelihoods were left behind. None of that was the system's problem. Once confined, the waiting began. This is where the pre-trial experience really settled in. Women accused of witchcraft were typically isolated. Solitary confinement was not a special punishment, it was standard procedure. The logic was simple. Isolation prevented influence from other witches. Also, it broke people down faster. Cells were dark, cold, bare, sometimes underground, sometimes shared with rats, sometimes shared with absolutely nothing else, which, depending on your personality, might be worse. Light was limited, food was minimal, water was inconsistent, sanitation was an afterthought. Sleep was irregular, not because guards were intentionally cruel at first, but because the environment itself made rest difficult. Cold stone, damp air, no bedding, noise, or the absence of noise, which has its own way of getting loud. This period could last days, weeks, sometimes months, and during this time, interrogation often began. Informal, unrecorded, conveniently deniable. Officials would come in, ask questions, leave, come back later, ask again, rephrase, repeat, contradict themselves. claim others had already confessed, because of course they had. The goal was not clarity, it was compliance. Women were asked about their habits, their dreams, their childhood, their grudges, their relationships, their thoughts in church, their thoughts outside church, their thoughts in general. Any answer could be twisted. Too confident meant suspicious. Too quiet meant evasive. Emotional meant unstable. Calm meant unnatural. There was no correct tone. And then there were the searches. Before a trial, women accused of witchcraft were often subjected to physical examinations. These were not medical. They were invasive, humiliating, and deeply violating. Officials believed witches bore marks, devil's marks, witches' teats, unnatural blemishes that supposedly fed demonic familiars. Basically, any mole, scar, birthmark, or irregularity could qualify. These examinations were conducted by other women, usually midwives or matrons, sometimes under supervision, sometimes alone, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes enthusiastically. It depended on the town and the politics and the personal grudges involved. The accused woman was stripped, inspected, prodded, poked, shaved. Yes, shaved. Hair removal was common, every inch, because witches could supposedly hide marks under hair. This was both invasive and practical. It made repeated inspections easier. Also, it stripped dignity quickly. Marks were pricked with needles to see if they bled or caused pain. If they did, that was suspicious. If they did not, that was suspicious. There was no winning. These searches could happen multiple times, especially if earlier examinations failed to find anything convincing, because clearly the devil was just being sneaky. While all this happened, the woman remained officially untried, presumed innocent in theory, already punished in practice. Outside the cell, her life unraveled. Property was often seized or managed by authorities, livestock neglected, crops failed, homes fell into disrepair, debts accumulated, children were displaced, sometimes taken in by relatives, sometimes not. Communities rarely stepped in to help. Suspicion spreads faster than charity. If a woman was married, her husband might distance himself, publicly, loudly, sometimes violently. It was safer to denounce than defend, especially if he wanted to keep his land. If she was unmarried, widowed, or poor, she had even fewer buffers, which is why accusations clustered so neatly around those categories. Funny how that works. As days turned into weeks, pressure intensified. Sleep deprivation was not always formalized, but it happened. Guards checked cells at odd hours. Interrogators returned late at night. Questions were repeated endlessly. Food might be withheld or offered conditionally. Confess and eat, cooperate and rest, resist and starve. This was not yet torture, officially. That came later. This was persuasion, and persuasion worked. Many women confessed before trial simply to end the waiting, to regain some control, to make something happen. Confessions obtained during pre-trial detention were often informal, later rewritten, later polished, later presented as voluntary. By the time a woman entered a courtroom, she was often exhausted, malnourished, disoriented, emotionally flattened. She had been living in a state of suspended terror for weeks or months, which did wonders for her credibility. And then there were the tests. Before trials, women accused of witchcraft were often subjected to ordeal-style tests, even when those were technically discouraged by law, because traditions die hard. Swimming tests, binding a woman and throwing her into water to see if she floated. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence, with the small downside of drowning. Weight tests, weighing a woman against a Bible, because obviously that makes sense. Prayer tests, asking her to recite prayers perfectly under stress. Any stumble meant the devil was blocking her words. These tests were rarely standardized. They varied wildly by region, which made them flexible, which made them dangerous. And remember, all of this happened before a trial. The trial itself was often a formality by that point. What is striking when you sit with this long enough is how administrative it all was. This was not chaos. This was procedure. Bad procedure, cruel procedure,
but still procedure. Systems triggered routines. Routines stripped people down slowly. There was time to get used to it, which might be the worst part. Women waited, and waited, and waited. Some were released, quietly, without apology, without compensation, their reputations permanently damaged. Others were transferred, moved from local detention to higher courts, which meant more travel, more confinement, more waiting. Some died before trial, from illness, from neglect, from despair. Their deaths rarely counted as outcomes, just administrative inconveniences. And through all this, the language remained calm, legal, detached. Records speak of women being kept safely, held for examination, maintained until judgment. Nothing about the cold, the hunger, the fear.
All right, welcome back. If you drifted off for a bit, that is completely on brand. Just let the voice pull you back in. We are still very much before the trial, still in the slow administrative swamp of suspicion and paperwork and quiet cruelty. So let us settle back into it. Where a woman was held before trial depended heavily on geography, money, and how much effort the local authorities wanted to expend. There was no universal witch-holding facility. This was all very improvisational. In some towns, the jail was a multi-purpose space. Thieves, drunkards, debtors, occasionally a goat, and now a suspected witch, all sharing the same damp air. In other places, especially smaller villages, there was no formal jail at all, so women were held in private homes, usually belonging to officials or wealthy citizens, or sometimes just whoever had a lock and was willing, which sounds almost cozy until you realize how completely powerless the woman was in that arrangement. Being held in someone's house meant constant observation, no privacy, no neutral authority, just you, your accusers, and their furniture. Hosts were paid for this service, which created a quiet incentive to keep prisoners longer, because of course it did. These households often restricted movement, limited food, controlled communication. Visits were rare and supervised. Letters, if allowed at all, were censored or never delivered. And the atmosphere was never neutral. Every cough was noted, every prayer overheard, every sigh interpreted. Women were told to behave, to be grateful, to cooperate, because good behavior might help them later, or at least that was the suggestion. Meanwhile, the rumor mill outside did not stop. Pre-trial detention was fertile ground for accusations to multiply. Neighbors came forward with stories they had forgotten, or invented, or reinterpreted. That time she looked at me strangely, that argument 10 years ago, that illness that followed a disagreement, that dream I had once, all of it was now evidence. Officials collected these statements slowly, methodically, with great interest, because quantity mattered more than quality. And while this happened, the accused woman was usually kept uninformed. She did not know what was being said, or by whom, or how many people had spoken, which meant she could not respond, or prepare, or even understand the scope of what was coming. Uncertainty is an excellent pressure tool. During this waiting period, religious instruction often intensified. Clergy visited, prayed, lectured, offered guidance, which often sounded a lot like encouragement to confess. Confession was framed as mercy. Confession would cleanse the soul. Confession would help the court. Confession would help everyone. Not confessing, on the other hand, suggested pride or stubbornness or demonic influence, none of which were flattering traits in this context. Some women confessed to minor things, superstitions, folk remedies, charms learned from their mothers, not realizing how those admissions would be stretched later. Others denied everything, calmly, firmly, repeatedly, which was interpreted as further proof of guilt, because resistance meant strength, and strength in a woman was suspicious. This is where the emotional erosion really set in. Isolation wore people down, time lost meaning, days blended together, without clocks, without calendars, without certainty.
Women began doubting their own memories. Did I say that? Did I do that? Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I deserved this, which is exactly where the system wanted them. And then there was the matter of physical restraint. Before trial, women were often bound, not continuously, but regularly. Hands tied during questioning, feet shackled at night, sometimes chained to walls. The stated purpose was security, the unstated purpose was control. Binding also reinforced the narrative. Dangerous people need restraints, therefore she must be dangerous. Some women were subjected to stress positions, forced to stand for long periods or sit without support. Again, not officially torture, just inconvenient discomfort. Because medieval and early modern legal systems loved technicalities. Actual torture required permission, formal authorization, specific procedures, and that usually came during trial. But everything before that existed in a gray zone, a very wide gray zone. Sleep deprivation continued. Guards woke prisoners to check on them, or claimed they heard noises, or suspected escape, or simply wanted compliance. Exhaustion softened resistance. Confusion made contradictions more likely. And contradictions were gold. A woman who misspoke was immediately suspect. A woman who corrected herself was even worse, because obviously she was lying. Memory under stress is unreliable, but that was never acknowledged. Instead, inconsistency was treated as intent. Meanwhile, physical health declined. Cells were cold and damp. Illness spread easily. Respiratory infections, skin conditions, digestive issues, malnutrition. Medical care was minimal, sometimes non-existent, sometimes deliberately withheld. A sick woman was more likely to confess, or at least appear fragile, which reinforced narratives of moral weakness. If she died, well, that solved the problem. Deaths before trial were often recorded blandly. She fell ill. She expired. God's will. No further inquiry needed. And then there were the children. If the accused woman had children, especially young ones, they were questioned too. Gently at first, then not so gently. Children were asked what their mother did at night, what she said, what animals she spoke to, what stories she told. Children want to please adults. They tell stories, they imagine, they guess. Their statements were taken seriously, sometimes more seriously than adult testimony, because children were considered innocent and therefore truthful, which is a terrifying assumption combined with leading questions. Children might be removed from their mother during this period, placed with relatives, or fostered elsewhere, or kept nearby but separated. The separation itself was a form of pressure. Confess and see your children. Cooperate, and maybe they will be safe. Some women confessed simply to end this separation or to protect their children from further questioning. And outside, life moved on. Markets opened, church bells rang, harvests continued, people gossiped. The accused woman existed in a paused state, neither guilty nor innocent, just held. This limbo could stretch on, especially if higher courts were involved, or if authorities were waiting for more accusations to strengthen their case. Efficiency was not the priority, certainty was, or at least the appearance of it. In some regions, women were transferred between jurisdictions, moved from village to town, town to city, city to regional court. Each transfer meant new confinement, new interrogators, new environments, new delays. Travel itself was grueling. Chains, wagons, exposure, spectators. Public visibility reinforced shame. People stared, whispered, spat, crossed themselves. By the time a woman arrived at trial, she had already been paraded as guilty. And through all of this, the language remained procedural. Calm, orderly. Officials wrote letters, filed reports, requested permissions, discussed logistics. Someone had to pay for food, someone had to pay for guards, someone had to pay for chains. Often the woman herself paid through seized property, through fines levied before judgment, through debts placed on her family. Justice was expensive, and she was footing the bill. What makes this especially chilling is how normalized it was. None of this was hidden. Communities knew, participated, approved. Neighbors volunteered information. Officials followed routines. Clergy offered spiritual framing. Everyone played their part. And still, all of this was before the trial. No verdict, no formal accusation read aloud, no defense offered. Just waiting and pressure and the slow collapse of certainty. So as we drift onward, keep that in mind. When we eventually reach the courtroom, remember how much had already happened. Because the trial was never the beginning. It was simply the next step. Let us ease forward. There are still regional differences to explore, still small variations in how this suffering was organized, and still many quiet details that reveal just how methodical it all was. So, settle back, let the thoughts blur, and we will continue.
All right, let us drift back in. Same dim room, same slow voice, nothing urgent happening anywhere. We are still very much before the trial, still circling the long administrative runway that led up to it. If part 2 felt like an endless waiting room, that is because it was. And now, quietly, we begin edging toward the point where authorities started asking for permission to do worse things, politely, in writing. Because nothing says justice like a well-formatted request. In many regions, especially in the early modern period, torture was technically regulated. You could not just start stretching people because you felt like it. There were rules, and those rules mattered, mostly on paper. Before trial, magistrates often assembled what they called a preliminary case. This was not a trial. This was a collection. Statements, rumors, physical marks, behavioral observations, vibes. Once this collection reached a certain thickness, someone decided it was time to escalate. But escalation required approval. So magistrates wrote to higher authorities, regional courts, princes, bishops, councils, explaining the situation carefully, calmly, with phrases like strong suspicion and grave indications. They listed the evidence, the neighbor statements, the inconsistencies in testimony, the failure to cry appropriately, the suspicious mole. And then they asked permission to apply sharper examination, which is one of history's least comforting phrases. While these letters traveled, the accused woman waited, still confined, still isolated, still being questioned. And sometimes, informally, torture began anyway. This is where legal theory and lived reality parted ways. Official torture required authorization. Unofficial pressure did not. So officials used what they called preparatory measures, tightening restraints, prolonged standing, exposure to cold, threats, displays of instruments, graphic descriptions of what might happen. Women were told what awaited them if they did not confess, in detail, slowly, repeatedly. And because people are people, many confessed before anything formal occurred. Confessions obtained this way were later treated as spontaneous, voluntary, inspired by conscience, because of course they were. If permission was granted, things became more structured. But even then, torture was often introduced gradually, because the goal was not pain for its own sake. It was information, or rather, confirmation. Authorities wanted names, networks, patterns. So, before trial, women might be subjected to what was considered mild torture, which is a phrase doing a lot of work. Strappado, being hoisted by the arms tied behind the back, sometimes dropped and caught repeatedly,
gentle in theory. Thumb screws, pressure on fingers, small, precise, easy to deny. Sleep deprivation formalized, interrogations at all hours, no rest, no rhythm. Water deprivation, or excessive water, depending on the mood. All carefully documented, or not documented, depending on local custom. And still, officially, this was pre-trial. The woman had not been found guilty, she was simply being examined, and examination could take days, weeks, multiple sessions. Between sessions, she returned to her cell, injured, sore, exhausted, alone. Guards were instructed to keep her from sleeping too deeply, or talking to others, or thinking too clearly, because clarity was dangerous. Confessions obtained this way were often inconsistent, which led to more questioning, which led to more pressure. Women might confess to impossible things, flying, shape-shifting, attending gatherings they had never heard of. Officials sometimes pushed back, gently, asking for more plausible details, because credibility mattered. So confessions were shaped, guided, edited. And remember, this is still before the trial. The courtroom, when it eventually arrived, would be the clean version. Another important pre-trial element was the involvement of experts. In some regions, demonologists were consulted, scholars who had read the books, written the treatises, cataloged the signs. They reviewed cases, offered opinions, suggested questions, interpreted behaviors. Their involvement added intellectual weight and distance. It is easier to harm someone when an expert assures you it is necessary. These experts rarely met the accused. They worked from reports, which meant their conclusions were shaped by whoever wrote them, and reports tend to reflect expectations. Meanwhile, the woman's body continued to betray her. Bruises, swelling, tremors, injuries from restraint. These physical signs were sometimes interpreted as further evidence, marks of struggle against the truth, or signs of demonic resistance. Illness was especially dangerous at this stage. A woman who fell sick might be denied care to see if she recovered naturally. Survival could be framed as proof of unnatural resilience, death as divine judgment. Either outcome was convenient. Another feature of this period was the gradual narrowing of possible futures. Early on, release was theoretically possible. With time, it became less so. Once resources had been spent, letters written, permissions granted, experts consulted, reputations invested, backing down became difficult. Officials did not like to admit mistakes. Communities did not like unresolved accusations. Someone had to be right, and that someone was never the accused. Women sensed this shift, the moment when hope thinned. They adjusted their behavior, became more compliant, more agreeable, more willing to say whatever was needed. Some tried to manage their confession strategically, admitting to minor charges, denying larger ones. Others named accomplices, neighbors, friends, family, because naming others sometimes bought time, and time was precious. Naming others also expanded the system, more arrests, more holding cells, more paperwork. Witch hunts fed themselves. And all of this happened before a single formal verdict. By the time a woman was brought before judges, the outcome was often predetermined. The trial itself functioned as a summary, a performance, a justification. But the real work had already been done in cells and corridors and letters and whispered conversations. What makes this phase particularly unsettling is how bureaucratic it was. Suffering was organized, scheduled, approved. Pain was applied gradually, with oversight. There were no sudden explosions, no dramatic turning points, just a slow tightening, and women disappeared into it. Some survived, scarred, changed, quietly released. Others did not. But even those who survived carried the weight, their names forever linked to suspicion, their social lives permanently altered, because even acquittal did not erase what had already happened. So as we continue drifting forward, remember that witch trials were not singular events. They were processes, long, methodical, predictable, and the pre-trial phase was where most of the damage occurred. Let us float onward. There are still more regional quirks, still more small procedural choices that shaped lives, still more quiet cruelty hiding in the margins. Settle back, breathe, and we'll continue.
All right, let us keep going. Same slow pace, same low lights, nothing sharp or exciting coming up. Just more of that long, administrative sigh that defined life before a witch trial ever officially began. At this point in the process, many women had been confined long enough that the outside world started to feel unreal. Time did not move normally in pre-trial detention. Days stretched, nights folded in on themselves. Without routine, the mind drifted. And that drift was noticed. Authorities paid close attention to behavior. Too quiet, too talkative, too prayerful, not prayerful enough. Everything was logged, or at least remembered, and memory was flexible. Some women began talking to themselves, which is not shocking when you leave someone alone in a stone room for weeks. But this was noted as suspicious, a sign of communion with unseen forces, or madness, which, in this context, was basically the same thing. Others withdrew completely, stopped responding, stared at walls, lay still for hours. That was also suspicious. Officials preferred a specific kind of despair, cooperative, verbal, contained. During this phase, religious pressure often intensified again, not dramatically, not theatrically, just steadily. Clergy visited more frequently, brought prayers, scripture, gentle lectures about repentance, about the soul, about how confession brought peace. They framed the situation as spiritual concern. We want to save you. We want to help you. Just tell the truth. The truth, of course, being whatever aligned with the existing narrative. Some women clung to religion fiercely, prayed constantly, quoted scripture, asked for communion. That could help or hurt, depending on the priest. A devout woman might be praised as repentant or suspected of hiding behind faith, because witches were known to mimic piety, apparently. Nothing was straightforward. Another pre-trial ritual that appeared in some regions was the public observation period. This was not a trial, not yet, but authorities allowed townspeople to see the accused woman, sometimes during transfers, sometimes during brief public appearances. The logic was transparency. The effect was humiliation. People stared, whispered, commented on her appearance, her posture, her injuries. She looked pale. She looked thin. She looks guilty. She looks innocent. She looks strange. None of these observations were neutral. Public exposure reinforced community consensus. This woman is already marked. And once marked, everything she did was filtered through that mark. If she cried, she was manipulative. If she did not cry, she was cold. If she spoke, she was defensive. If she stayed silent, she was hiding something. There was no behavior that read as innocent anymore.
At this stage, officials often began preparing the trial documents, drafting charges, summarizing confessions, selecting which statements mattered. This is where the story hardened. Early inconsistencies were smoothed out. Contradictions were resolved in favor of accusation. Anything that complicated the narrative was quietly dropped. Women did not see these documents. They did not know what story was being told about them. Sometimes, officials read excerpts aloud during questioning, selectively, to provoke responses or despair. Imagine being told what you supposedly said weeks ago, after weeks of sleep deprivation, and being asked to confirm it. Many women nodded, agreed, assumed they must have said it. Memory under pressure is a fragile thing. During this period, some women attempted resistance in small ways, refusing food, refusing to answer questions, refusing to stand. These acts rarely helped. They were interpreted as obstinacy, or demonic interference, or weakness. Punishments followed: reduced rations, tighter restraints, more isolation. Other women tried to negotiate, offering partial confessions, bargaining for leniency, promising cooperation in exchange for mercy. Sometimes officials encouraged this. Sometimes they shut it down. It depended on how far the process had already gone. Once too many resources were invested, mercy became inconvenient. One of the more quietly devastating aspects of pretrial detention was how it eroded identity. Women lost their names, became the accused, the prisoner, the witch. They were referred to in third person even when present, spoken about, not to. Decisions were made without their input, about their bodies, their futures, their families. Agency disappeared piece by piece. Even small choices vanished: when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, when to move. And without choice, the sense of self weakens. This made later confessions easier. A woman who no longer trusted her own judgment was more likely to accept the authority of others, which again was the point. In some regions, officials allowed the accused to consult legal counsel before trial. In theory. In practice, this was rare. Lawyers were expensive, families were hesitant to associate, and counsel could be limited in what they were allowed to do. Sometimes a lawyer visited once, offered vague advice, encouraged cooperation. Sometimes no one came, and silence filled the gaps. Another element that surfaced during this time was the reinterpretation of ordinary life. Daily habits were reframed as sinister. Herbal knowledge became sorcery. Quiet temperament became secrecy. Social isolation became evidence of unnatural behavior. Widowhood was suspicious. Poverty was suspicious. Independence was suspicious. Even kindness could be twisted: helping neighbors, assisting births, caring for animals. Anything that set a woman apart could be repurposed. And all of this happened while she waited. This waiting did not feel passive. It was active erosion. Each day stripped something away: strength, certainty, hope. Women marked time by visits, interrogations, meals, or lack thereof. They learned the rhythms of the guards, the moods of officials, the patterns of pressure. Survival became tactical. Some women learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to appear confused, when to appear remorseful. Others never adapted and suffered for it. There were also moments of accidental kindness: a guard who brought extra bread, a matron who spoke gently, a priest who seemed conflicted. These moments mattered, briefly, but they did not change the outcome, because systems move forward regardless of individual discomfort. As the trial date approached, confinement sometimes intensified again: more frequent questioning, more rehearsing of confessions, more reminders of what was expected. Women were told what would happen if they recanted, if they changed their story, if they embarrassed the court. The trial was framed as a test. Do well and mercy might follow. Do poorly and consequences awaited. But by this point, doing well meant aligning perfectly with the narrative. Truth was irrelevant. What is most unsettling when you slow down enough to see it is how unsurprising this all was to the people involved. Officials did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as careful, thorough, responsible. Communities saw the process as unfortunate but necessary, a burden borne for collective safety. And women disappeared into that logic quietly. There were no dramatic crescendos, no cinematic moments, just long days, cold rooms, endless repetition. And then, eventually, the trial. But by then, the trial was almost anticlimactic, because the real story had already unfolded in waiting rooms and holding cells and whispered conversations. The trial was just the last administrative step. So, as we continue drifting forward, remember that when a woman finally stood before judges, she had already endured weeks or months of punishment, her body marked, her mind worn, her identity reshaped. And that context mattered, even if the court pretended it did not. We'll keep going. There is still more to unpack, more small details that show how deeply normalized this suffering was. So breathe slowly, let your thoughts soften, and when you're ready, we'll move on.
All right, let us continue. Same slow drift, same low stakes. We are now very close to the trial, but not quite there yet. This is the strange, quiet stretch right before it begins. The part where everyone pretends something important is about to happen, even though most outcomes are already locked in. For the accused woman, this phase often felt oddly still. After weeks or months of pressure, the sudden calm was unsettling. Interrogations slowed, visits became less frequent, officials stopped asking new questions. Instead, they repeated old ones, checking alignment, making sure the story had not drifted. This calm was not kindness, it was preparation. The woman was usually informed that the trial was approaching, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. A guard mentioned it, a priest hinted, a clerk brought fresh clothes. Fresh clothes mattered, appearance mattered. She might be washed, not gently, hair combed or cut, injuries covered where possible, because courts liked order, they liked presentable defendants. A broken-looking woman could provoke sympathy or discomfort, better to tidy things up. This was not restoration, it was staging. During this time, officials reviewed everything one last time. Confessions were read aloud, sometimes to the woman herself, sometimes to others. If she hesitated, if she questioned wording, if she corrected details, that was discouraged. Now was not the time for changes. Some women tried anyway, attempted to retract confessions, claimed coercion, claimed misunderstanding. These attempts rarely went far. Retractions were framed as further deceit or evidence of instability. A woman who changed her story at this point was considered dangerous, unpredictable, deeply compromised. And so, pressure returned, quietly, firmly. Clergy visited again, with urgency this time, encouraging acceptance, submission, repentance. The language shifted slightly from investigation to salvation. Prepare your soul, make peace, speak truthfully tomorrow, which again meant compliance. Some women asked about their children, their property, their futures. Answers were vague, deferred, conditional. It all depends, they were told,
Everything depended on tomorrow, but tomorrow was already written. Another subtle element of this phase was the way community attention sharpened. People knew the trial was coming. Word spread, not officially, but effectively. Neighbors speculated, took sides, rehearsed their opinions. For some, this was entertainment. For others, reassurance, proof that order was being restored. The woman at the center of it all remained largely invisible. She might hear distant sounds, bells, voices, footsteps, life continuing without her. Inside the cell, anticipation replaced confusion. Fear became more specific, less abstract. She imagined the courtroom, the judges, the faces. Some women rehearsed what they would say, over and over, trying to remember the approved version. Others dissociated, went quiet, detached. Both were understandable responses. Sleep was difficult, either from anxiety or interruption. Guards checked more frequently, making sure she was still there, still compliant, still alive, because losing her now would be inconvenient. Food might improve slightly, a small mercy, or a practical choice, better to have her conscious. Physical restraints were sometimes loosened, or sometimes not. Again, it depended. This variability was part of the system. Uncertainty kept people off balance. During this final pre-trial stretch, paperwork accelerated. Charges were finalized, witness lists confirmed, schedules set. The tone of documents became formal, definitive, less speculation, more assertion. What had once been suspicion was now fact. She is known to have practiced. She has confessed to. She is notorious for. Language does powerful work. Once written down, it becomes harder to undo. In some regions, the accused woman was allowed one last opportunity to confess fully, to name names, to express remorse. This was framed as generosity. Confess now, spare yourself worse later. Some women took this opportunity, expanded their confessions, named more people. Others refused, held firm, or simply had nothing left to give. Both paths led forward. Another quiet detail of this phase was how emotions were managed. Officials avoided overt cruelty now, not out of compassion, but professionalism. The hard work was done, no need to complicate things. They wanted a smooth trial, a clean record, a convincing outcome. Emotional volatility could interfere, so things stayed calm, controlled, polite, which can be more unsettling than chaos. The woman was often moved to a different holding space closer to the courtroom, a cleaner cell, a more public building. This move was symbolic, transitioning from investigation to judgment. And still, officially, she was not guilty. That word had not yet been spoken, but everyone behaved as if it had. What stands out most about this moment, when you slow it down enough, is how lonely it was. The frenzy had passed, the pressure had peaked, and now there was just waiting. Waiting with full knowledge of what was coming. No distractions, no hope of reversal, just anticipation. For some women, this was the moment they broke down, cried, begged, prayed aloud. For others, it was the moment they went numb. Emotion flattened, survival instincts shut off, which courts sometimes interpreted as calm acceptance or demonic indifference. Again, no response was safe. As dawn approached, routines tightened. Guards prepared. Officials arrived. Clergy readied themselves. The machinery moved into position. And the woman waited. By the time she was led into the courtroom, she had already endured social death, physical violation, psychological erosion. She had been reshaped to fit the narrative. The trial would simply confirm it. But that part, the trial itself, is almost beside the point, because the story we are telling tonight is not about verdicts, It is about process, about how systems wear people down quietly, patiently, legally, about how harm can be procedural. So, as we settle in to the end of this long prelude, remember that when the trial finally began, it did not introduce injustice, it concluded it. Take a slow breath. Let the thoughts fade a little. There is nothing left to decide here, only to observe how gently and thoroughly everything had already been decided for her.
All right, let us keep drifting. Same calm pace, same low, even voice. If you have lost track of where we are in the story, that is perfectly fine. The people living it often did too. The trial has happened now, officially. Words were spoken, questions were asked, a verdict was reached. Guilty, or sometimes not guilty. But tonight, that distinction matters less than you might think. Because Part 6 is about what happened after the verdict, and how, for many women, the trial did not actually change much at all. If a woman was found guilty, the path forward was grim but clear. Sentencing followed, timelines were set, procedures resumed. The system knew what to do with her now. But if she was acquitted, or partially cleared, or released for lack of evidence, that is where things get strangely quiet and strangely cruel. An acquitted woman was not escorted home with apologies. There were no public corrections, no announcements of error. She was simply released, sometimes at dawn, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes with paperwork she could not read. She walked out carrying nothing, no property, no money, no guarantee of safety. Because acquittal did not erase suspicion. In many communities, a woman who had been accused was already considered contaminated. The trial did not cleanse her. It confirmed that something had been wrong enough to justify investigation. People reasoned backwards. Authorities would not have acted without cause, therefore the cause must exist. Logic like this is very comforting for communities. It means the system works. It means no one needs to feel uncomfortable. So the woman returned to a life that no longer recognized her. Her home might be gone, sold, seized, occupied, her belongings lost or damaged. Neighbors avoided her. Employers refused her. Markets closed quietly. Children were teased. Spouses were distant. Relatives cautious. Some women were told directly not to return, for their own safety or the community's, which meant exile without sentence. Others returned and lived on the margins, quiet, isolated, watching every word. Because a second accusation was easier than the first, the system remembered her. For women who had confessed under pressure and were later released, the situation was worse. Confession lingered, even if retracted, even if officially discounted. Once spoken, it could not be unheard. Records existed, notes, letters, mentions. Her name circulated in legal archives and local memory. She was marked. Some women changed towns, changed names, started over where no one knew them. That was rare. Travel required money, connections, strength. Most stayed and endured. Now, for women who were convicted, the post-verdict period was structured, cold, procedural. They were moved again, held again, sometimes for weeks before sentencing was carried out. This waiting was different from before. There were no more questions, no more negotiations, no more hope of altering the narrative. The system no longer needed anything from her, which meant attention faded. Guards were less watchful, clergy less persistent, officials less present.
The woman existed in a strange calm, a bureaucratic afterthought. Some were allowed visits, some were not. Some were encouraged to confess again, more cleanly, more completely. These final confessions were often written carefully, edited, polished. They served a purpose beyond the individual. They justified the system, reinforced belief. And belief mattered. Because witch trials were never just about one woman. They were about reaffirming order, removing perceived threats, demonstrating authority. Fear was a tool, but reassurance was the goal. And reassurance required stories that made sense. So confessions were shaped to be instructive, clear, morally tidy. Messy realities were smoothed away. Meanwhile, the woman's body continued to deteriorate. Injuries worsened, illness spread, strength faded. Medical care remained minimal because outcomes were already determined. If she died before sentencing was carried out, that was recorded, not mourned. Another administrative inconvenience. For women executed, the community often treated the aftermath as closure. The danger had been removed, order restored. People returned to routines, markets reopened, gossip shifted to new topics. Children grew up hearing simplified versions of events. There was a witch, she was dealt with, case closed. But for women who survived, acquitted or not, the story did not end. Survivors lived with constant awareness. Every illness, every accident, every argument carried risk. They moderated their behavior, reduced visibility, limited speech. They learned when to withdraw, when to comply, when to disappear. This quiet self-policing was one of the most lasting effects of witch trials. Communities learned too. They learned which behaviors attracted suspicion, which women were vulnerable, which accusations worked, and they remembered. That memory shaped future accusations, future procedures. The system refined itself. From a distance, witch trials look chaotic, hysterical, irrational. Up close, they look administrative. Forms, letters, timelines, approvals. Human suffering processed through routine, and women were the raw material. What makes this especially heavy when you sit with it long enough is how ordinary everyone involved believed they were being. Officials followed rules, clergy followed doctrine, neighbors followed instinct. No one needed to see themselves as cruel. Cruelty was diffused, shared, diluted, and that made it sustainable. For the women at the center, life after accusation was defined by absence. Absence of trust, absence of safety, absence of certainty. Even decades later, a whisper could resurface, a memory, a record, and the past would reattach itself. This is why accusations were so powerful. They did not require conviction to destroy lives. Suspicion alone was enough. So when we talk about witch trials, it's tempting to focus on flames, on verdicts, on dramatic endings. But the real damage happened earlier and lingered later, in the waiting, in the paperwork, in the quiet aftermath, in the lives that continued, diminished. And that is why this story matters. Not because it's shocking, or thrilling, or extreme, but because it shows how easily systems can normalize harm, slowly, calmly, with good intentions. No monsters required, just people doing their jobs. So as we let this final part settle, let your thoughts drift. Let the details blur together. Stone rooms, paper documents, soft voices, long waits. History is often loud, but sometimes the most lasting harm happens very quietly. And on that note, there is nothing left to resolve, only to rest. Let the lights stay low, let the voice fade, and we'll leave these women where history so often does, uncelebrated, unapologized to, and far too easy to forget.
All right, we are still here, still moving slowly, still letting the story stretch out instead of racing anywhere. Part 6 is bigger than Part 6, not because more things happen, but because the consequences spread wider and last longer. This is the part where the system steps back, folds its hands, and pretends everything is finished. The verdict has been delivered, the punishment carried out, or not. The paperwork stamped. The officials move on to other matters. Harvests, taxes, boundary disputes, the next problem. But the accusation does not move on. It stays. It lingers in places no record book can fully capture. In many towns, the name of an accused woman became shorthand, a reference point, a warning. Parents told children not to wander near her old house. Neighbors lowered their voices when passing the spot where she once lived. Stories simplified over time. Details blurred. Motives faded. What remained was the label. She was strange. She was dangerous. She was not like us. And this label did not need accuracy to survive. It only needed repetition. Years later, new accusations often leaned on old ones. A woman accused in the present was linked verbally to women accused in the past, sometimes as relatives, sometimes as students, sometimes just symbolically. The past validated the present. This is how fear becomes inheritance. In some regions, legal records of witch trials were preserved carefully, filed, indexed, stored in archives. These documents were meant to prove diligence, responsibility, due process, but they also froze suspicion in ink. A woman acquitted decades earlier could be mentioned in a new case as precedent, as context, as evidence that witchcraft had once existed here. Her name resurfaced without her consent, without her voice. The record outlived her. For families, the consequences stretched across generations. Children of accused women carried quiet burdens. Marriage prospects suffered. Business relationships stalled. Trust eroded. A family name could become risky. Some families changed names, moved, fragmented. Others stayed and absorbed the stigma, learned to live smaller lives. Even when communities outwardly moved on, memory stayed active, selective, convenient. When disasters struck, memory sharpened. Crop failures, illness, fires, floods. People searched backward for explanation, and old accusations resurfaced. Someone once said she was a witch. Maybe that was not wrong. This backward reasoning was comforting. It made chaos feel manageable. Blame is easier than uncertainty. Another long-term effect of witch trials was behavioral narrowing. Women learned, communities learned. Certain behaviors faded, knowledge transmission shifted, herbal medicine retreated into secrecy. Midwives became cautious. Folk traditions were practiced quietly or abandoned. Women reduced visibility, reduced speech, reduced independence. Not because laws explicitly demanded it, but because memory enforced it. This is how power works best, when it no longer needs to speak. Men were accused too, of course, but women bore the brunt, and the lessons were gendered. Be quiet, be ordinary, be attached to a man, be predictable. Deviation invited danger. The system did not need to accuse everyone. It only needed to accuse enough to teach the rest, and that lesson held across centuries.
Another aspect that grew over time was reinterpretation. Later generations often reframed witch trials as unfortunate mistakes, products of ignorance, religious excess, bad science. This framing is comforting. It creates distance. They were foolish. We are wiser. But the mechanisms remained. Suspicion, bureaucracy, isolation, confession under pressure, social death before legal death. Only the language changed. And women continued to be targets when societies felt anxious. What witch trials reveal, when you look at them long enough, is not hysteria, but structure. They show how systems respond to fear by narrowing acceptable behavior, by selecting vulnerable individuals, by converting rumor into record, by making harm feel reasonable. This is why the pre-trial phase mattered so much. It was where the system tested its own assumptions, where it shaped reality before anyone publicly acknowledged it. By the time judgment came, the work was already done. The aftermath simply cemented it. One of the quiet tragedies of this history is how rarely women's own words survive outside confessions. Letters, diaries, personal accounts are scarce. What we have instead are summaries written by others, descriptions filtered through authority. She said this, she admitted that, she behaved strangely. Her interior life is mostly gone, which makes the echo louder, not softer, because silence invites projection. Historians have tried to reconstruct these lives, carefully, respectfully. They read between lines, study patterns, compare cases. They notice how often accused women were poor, or widowed, or socially marginal. How often they had survived trauma, illness, loss. How often they had simply outlived their usefulness to someone else. These patterns do not excuse what happened, they explain it. And explanation matters, because without it, history becomes a collection of strange anecdotes instead of a warning. The witch trials did not end because people suddenly became kind. They ended because legal standards shifted, because states centralized power, because elites decided the chaos was inefficient, not because compassion won. Which means the underlying logic never disappeared. It just learned new shapes. So when we sit with this story tonight, letting it stretch across hours and parts and long, slow sentences, the point is not outrage. Outrage is loud, brief, energizing. This story is about quiet endurance, about how harm becomes normalized, documented, forgotten, and about how women lived in the shadow of accusation long after the fires cooled and the courts adjourned. If you listen closely, that shadow still exists, in the way people talk about danger, about morality, about who needs watching. History does not repeat neatly, but it rhymes softly, constantly. And those rhymes often begin the same way, with a rumor, with paperwork, with waiting. So as we let this final extended echo fade, allow your thoughts to loosen. Stone rooms dissolve, ink fades, names blur. What remains is the pattern, and patterns are the hardest things to unlearn. There is nothing left to prove tonight, nothing to resolve, only to notice how long the echo lasts, and how quietly it travels. So rest now. Let the voice slow. Let the story drift back into the dark, where history so often leaves it. Still there, still whispering, still waiting.
All right, let us keep going. Even slower now. If Part 7 felt like an echo that refused to fade, Part 8 is what happens when people grow used to that echo, when it becomes background noise, when it stops sounding like cruelty
and starts sounding like order. This is the part where nothing dramatic happens at all, and that is exactly the problem. Long after the last trial in a region, long after the final confession was written and filed, the habits created by witch accusations stayed active. Not officially, not openly, but practically. Communities did not sit down and say, "We learned our lesson." They rarely do. Instead, they adjusted behavior, quietly, incrementally, in ways that felt sensible at the time. Suspicion became a skill. People learned how to watch each other without appearing to, how to phrase concern as care, how to turn discomfort into moral language. "She makes me uneasy" slowly evolved into "I worry about her influence," which became "people are talking," which became "someone should look into this." No accusation required, no court needed, just consensus. Women noticed first. They noticed which traits drew attention, which habits attracted commentary, which lives looked safest. Safety did not mean happiness, it meant invisibility. So women adjusted. They spoke less, shared less knowledge, helped quietly instead of publicly, kept disagreements private, accepted small humiliations to avoid larger ones. This was not submission in a dramatic sense, it was adaptation, the kind humans are very good at. And adaptation looks a lot like consent from the outside. Over time, the image of the dangerous woman shifted. No longer a witch officially, but still something adjacent. The meddler, the gossip, the troublemaker, the immoral one, the unstable one. Labels changed, function stayed the same. When legal systems grew more centralized and witch trials became embarrassing relics, authorities did not abandon control, they refined it. They replaced supernatural language with moral language, or medical language, or legal language. A woman was no longer possessed, she was hysterical, or unfit, or disruptive, or indecent, still in need of correction, still a problem to be managed. And just like before, management often happened before any formal process began. Social isolation, loss of reputation, economic pressure, family withdrawal. The pre-trial phase never went away, it simply stopped being called that. Another quiet legacy of witch trials was how communities learned to outsource responsibility. During the trials, everyone participated a little. No one felt fully accountable. Afterward, that habit stuck. If something went wrong, people looked outward, to authority, to systems, to experts. Someone else will handle it, someone else knows better. Which is comforting and dangerous, because it allows harm to feel distant even when you are part of it. Histories of witch trials often focus on belief, on superstition, on fear of the supernatural. But belief was only one ingredient. The more powerful ingredient was permission. Permission to suspect, permission to isolate, permission to punish without certainty. Once people learned they could do that and still see themselves as good, the lesson stayed. Even as beliefs changed, even as gods changed, even as laws changed. Another long shadow of witch accusations was how communities learned to conflate morality with conformity. Good people behaved predictably, bad people deviated. This equation simplified the world, made it easier to manage. It also punished creativity, independence, difference, especially in women, especially in those already vulnerable. Which is why witch trials cluster where inequality already exists. They do not create hierarchies, they exploit them.
Looking back, it's tempting to frame the end of witch trials as progress, and it was, in a narrow sense. Fewer executions, more skepticism, better legal standards. But the deeper lesson was never fully addressed. The lesson was not witches do not exist. It was we were willing to destroy people on insufficient evidence. And that's a much harder thing to sit with, because it implicates everyone. So, instead, societies chose an easier takeaway. We were ignorant. They believed strange things. That could never happen again, which allowed the underlying mechanisms to survive untouched. If you strip away the costumes, the rituals, the language, what remains is a familiar process. Someone is identified as a problem. They are isolated socially. Their credibility is undermined. Pressure is applied privately. Outcomes are justified publicly. By the time anyone asks whether it was fair, the damage is already done. That's the real legacy of witch trials. Not the flames, not the trials, not even the confessions, but the workflow. And workflows are resilient. They adapt, they modernize, they rename themselves. They wait for the next moment of anxiety, the next crisis, the next group that feels easy to blame. This is why historians keep returning to witch trials, not because they are exotic, but because they are familiar. They show us what people do when fear meets structure, when uncertainty meets authority, when harm becomes procedural, and when ordinary people convince themselves they are simply doing what must be done. So as we come to the end of this long stretch, this final expansion of the echo, let the story settle where it belongs, not in outrage, not in judgment, not even in sorrow, but in awareness. Because awareness is quiet and slow and uncomfortable, much like everything we've talked about tonight. There is no dramatic conclusion here, no lesson neatly tied with a ribbon, just a pattern laid bare, and the knowledge that patterns do not disappear just because we stop naming them. So rest now. Let the names fade, let the paperwork crumble, let the accusations lose their grip. But keep the shape of it somewhere in the back of your mind, because history rarely asks us to remember dates, it asks us to recognize ourselves. And on that gentle, unsettling note, we finally let the voice slow to nothing. The story does not end. It simply goes quiet and waits.
All right, we are still moving, slowly, gently, no sharp turns. If this feels like it could go on forever, that is kind of the point, because Part 9 is about how silence itself becomes inherited, how it settles in, how it starts feeling normal, even responsible. By this stage, long after the last official witch trial in many regions, people no longer talked about witches very much, at least not directly. The word itself became embarrassing, old-fashioned, a reminder of something people preferred to see as childish. But the habits remained. Communities did not dismantle them, they simply stopped explaining them. No one said women should keep their heads down because accusations once destroyed lives. They just said, it's better not to draw attention. No one said, speaking out can be dangerous. They said, be careful how that looks. No one said, power punishes unpredictability. They said, that's just how things are. And over time, these phrases hardened into wisdom, advice passed down, common sense, survival tips. This is how trauma disguises itself as tradition. Young girls learned early what kinds of behavior were praised: quietness, helpfulness, modesty, agreeableness. They also learned, often without words, what kinds of behavior caused discomfort: anger, confidence, curiosity that went too far, knowledge that could not be neatly explained. No one needed to mention witches. The lesson had already been absorbed.
Older women enforced these lessons too, not always cruelly, often protectively. They warned younger women to be careful, to avoid gossip, to avoid conflict, to avoid standing out. This was not betrayal, it was adaptation. They had seen what happened to women who became visible in the wrong way, and they wanted the next generation to survive. So silence was taught as safety. Another long effect of witch accusations was the way communities learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe, which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records. It operated socially, professionally, familiarly. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers, not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety, and if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe, which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records.
It operated socially, professionally, familially. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers, not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety, and if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe, which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records. It operated socially, professionally, familiarly. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers, not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety, and if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued.
All right, we are still here, still moving at the speed of a tired candle flame. Part 10 is longer, slower, and heavier than Part 9, not because more events happen, but because this is where everything finally settles into everyday life. This is where history stops feeling like history and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. By now, witch trials are no longer happening, at least not in the way people imagine them. No stakes, no formal accusations shouted in public squares, no judges asking about familiars or midnight flights. And yet, the structure survives. It survives because it worked.
Societies rarely abandon systems that successfully maintain order. They just rename them. They soften the edges. They remove the parts that look embarrassing in hindsight. The goal remains the same. Identify disruption, contain it, neutralize it, move on. The people involved do not think of themselves as cruel, they think of themselves as reasonable. And that is where the real danger lives. After witch trials faded, communities learned to trust processes more than people. Paperwork replaced testimony, credentials replaced character, reputation replaced truth. If a person was labeled difficult by enough authorities, that label became reality. And just like before, the damage happened early, long before any official decision, long before any formal consequence. A woman's reputation could begin unraveling over time, subtly. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, a quiet warning passed along. She's a bit unstable. She has a history. She doesn't work well with others. None of these statements require proof. They just need repetition. And repetition is powerful. What witch trials revealed was not mass hysteria, but the efficiency of collective agreement. Once enough people agreed something was wrong, the system aligned itself around that belief. Evidence followed belief, not the other way around. That pattern never disappeared. It just learned how to sound professional. Another inheritance from the era of witch trials is how institutions learned to protect themselves first. During trials, officials were rarely punished for false accusations. Admitting error threatened authority, so outcomes were justified retroactively. After the trials ended, that instinct remained. Institutions still prioritize credibility, stability, control. Individuals who threaten that balance are framed as risks, and risks must be managed. Management sounds gentle, responsible, necessary. It is rarely neutral. Women continue to experience this most intensely, especially those who fall outside narrow expectations. Too assertive, too emotional, too knowledgeable, too unwilling to soften themselves. These traits once marked someone as suspicious. Now they mark someone as difficult. Different word, same function. The witch trials taught societies that you do not need to destroy everyone. You only need to make examples. One woman accused publicly teaches dozens privately. One career quietly derailed teaches others to stay silent. One reputation ruined teaches conformity better than any law. Fear does not need spectacle, it needs consistency. Another long shadow of witch trials is the way suffering is reframed as personal failure. If a woman struggled after accusation, it was because she was weak, or flawed, or unstable, not because the system broke her. That logic persists. If someone collapses under pressure, we rarely ask how the pressure was applied. We ask what is wrong with them. This shifts responsibility away from structures onto individuals, which is very convenient. The women who survived witch accusations often lived quieter lives afterward, not because they wanted to, but because quietness was safer. That lesson echoes across centuries. Speak carefully, disclose selectively, trust slowly, assume risk. This is not paranoia, it is learned behavior, and learned behavior is hard to unlearn. One of the most subtle consequences of witch trials is how they taught societies to confuse peace with justice. When accusations stopped, communities felt relieved. Order had returned, calm restored. But calm does not mean fairness. Silence does not mean healing. It often means exhaustion. Women learned to stop pushing because pushing hurt. Communities learned to stop questioning because questioning destabilized things. Everyone learned that moving on mattered more than understanding what went wrong. So the past was buried quickly, not examined,
not processed, just covered over. And buried things have a habit of shaping the ground above them. Another quiet inheritance is how people learned to distrust those who speak from lived experience. Women accused of witchcraft were dismissed as unreliable narrators, emotional, confused, manipulative. That dismissal did not end with the trials. Even today, personal testimony is often treated as weaker than documentation, even when documentation was created by those in power. This imbalance has roots. When the only surviving records are written by authorities, authority becomes truth by default, and the accused remain voiceless. This is why history feels one-sided, not because women had nothing to say, but because systems did not preserve their voices. Silence, again. By the time societies began critically re-examining witch trials, centuries had passed. The women were gone, their words lost, their lives summarized in margins. It became safe to criticize the past. Those people were foolish, superstitious, cruel. We are better now. That belief is comforting. It is also incomplete. We are better at hiding harm, better at rationalizing it, better at calling it something else. Witch trials remind us that injustice does not require villains. It requires incentives. It requires fear. It requires hierarchy. It believes that some people are easier to sacrifice than others. Those conditions still exist. They always will. Which means the story is never really over. This is why Part 10 feels heavier, because by now there is no distance left, no costumes, no strange beliefs to laugh at, no dramatic rituals to point to and say, that was different. What remains is the structure, and the structure is familiar. It shows up whenever institutions prioritize themselves over individuals, whenever communities value comfort over truth, whenever silence is praised as maturity. The women accused of witchcraft were not special cases, they were early examples. They were warnings written in lives instead of laws. Warnings that say this: if a system can hurt someone quietly, it will. If a community can look away, it often does. If fear can be managed through exclusion, it will be. And it will feel reasonable at the time. That is the hardest lesson. Not that cruelty exists, but that cruelty often wears the face of normalcy. So as we come to the end of Part 10, let the story finally slow to almost nothing. No conclusions, no calls to action, no neat moral. Just awareness. Awareness that history is not only about what people believed, but about what they allowed, about what they normalized, about what they decided was easier not to confront. And awareness is quiet work. It does not shout, it does not accuse, it simply notices, which is exactly what we have been doing all along. Let the voice soften now. Let the long echo finally fade into background hum. The story does not end here. It never really does. It just becomes part of the air we breathe. And tonight, that is enough.
All right, we keep going. Same slow pace, same low volume. Nothing sharp, nothing urgent. Part 11 sits right next to Part 10, not as a sequel full of new events, but as a continuation of the same quiet realization. This is the part where normal settles in so deeply that it stops being questioned at all. By now, the world shaped by witch trials no longer remembers them consciously. The word itself sounds historical, decorative, something for museums in themed festivals and badly researched TV shows. But the behaviors that survived are invisible precisely because they are ordinary. That is always how it works. When something becomes routine, it stops needing justification. After the age of witch trials, societies did not sit down and decide how to treat women differently. They simply carried forward assumptions that had already been tested, assumptions that had already proven effective at keeping order. Women learned that credibility was fragile, that it could be revoked quickly, sometimes without explanation. Men learned that authority was quieter now, but no less firm. Institutions learned that you did not need public punishments. Subtle pressure worked better. It avoided backlash. It preserved appearances. Everyone learned that stability mattered more than fairness. And these lessons were never written down, which made them harder to challenge. Because how do you argue against something no one admits exists? One of the most lasting effects of witch trials is how suspicion became internalized. Women did not just fear accusation from others, they learned to monitor themselves, their tone, their expressions, their ambitions, their anger. Self-regulation replaced external force. This was efficient. A woman who policed herself required no jailer. This internal vigilance was passed down quietly, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, friend to friend, not as oppression, as advice. Don't say that like that. Maybe let him explain it. It's better not to make a scene. People will misunderstand. Misunderstanding became the threat, not punishment. Which is clever, really. Punishment creates resistance. Misunderstanding creates compliance. Another inheritance from witch trials is the way systems learned to frame harm as unfortunate but necessary. During trials, officials often expressed regret. They claimed no pleasure in the outcome. They insisted the process was regrettable but unavoidable. That language never disappeared. Today, harm is explained as procedure, policy, best practice. No one is responsible. Everyone followed the rules. Rules become shields, and those harmed are expected to accept this with grace. The women accused of witchcraft were expected to confess, repent, accept their fate. Modern systems expect something similar. Acceptance is praised, resistance is suspect. This is not accidental. Witch trials taught societies that people who accept blame quietly are easier to manage than people who question authority. So questioning was discouraged, not banned, just made uncomfortable. Another quiet legacy is how communities learned to conflate morality with conformity. Good women were predictable, reliable, consistent. Bad women were erratic, emotional, uncontained. This distinction did not require supernatural belief. It required comfort. People trust what feels familiar, and familiarity often looks like sameness. Those who deviated became stressful. Stressful people are often framed as problems, and problems invite solutions. This logic sounds cold when written out, but in real life it feels gentle, reasonable, even caring. We just want everyone to get along. We just want things to run smoothly. Why are you making this difficult? These phrases do a lot of work. They shift responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. If you are uncomfortable, it is because you are wrong. If you are harmed, it is because you did not adapt. Witch trials were brutal because they were explicit. Their successors are subtle because they are implicit, and subtle harm lasts longer. Another long shadow is how history itself is curated. Witch trials are often framed as an embarrassing detour, a brief lapse, a strange moment before enlightenment returned. This framing is convenient. It allows modern societies to distance themselves from the underlying logic. We are rational now. We use evidence. We protect rights. All true. And yet the same groups remain vulnerable. Those with less power, those who challenge norms, those who are easy to isolate.
History becomes comforting when it is simplified, dangerous when it is examined closely. The women accused of witchcraft remind us that systems do not need evil intent to cause suffering. They need permission. Permission to prioritize order, permission to ignore complexity, permission to decide someone is expendable. That permission is rarely revoked. It just becomes harder to see. Another thing witch trials taught societies is how to handle regret. When the trials ended, there was no widespread apology, no collective mourning, no attempt to make amends. The past was closed quickly. This set a precedent. When harm is acknowledged too deeply, it threatens legitimacy. So harm is acknowledged shallowly. Yes, mistakes were made. Times were different. We've moved on. Moving on becomes the moral act, not accountability. This pattern repeats. It repeats in institutions, in families, in cultures. Silence is framed as maturity. Speaking is framed as dwelling. The women who survived witch accusations often lived with unresolved grief, unspoken anger, quiet bitterness. There was no space for processing, and unprocessed harm does not disappear. It hardens. It turns into caution, into distance, into resignation. Those traits are then mistaken for personality. She's cold, she's bitter, she's withdrawn. No one asks why. Another of the unsettling legacies of witch trials is how effectively they taught societies to forget individuals while remembering rules. Names fade, procedures remain. This is why we know more about trial methods than about the women themselves. Records preserve systems, not souls, and systems prefer it that way. So when we look back, we see structures, not lives, and that distance makes repetition easier. If harm is abstract, it feels less urgent. Part 11 is where all of this settles into something like background noise, not loud enough to demand attention, loud enough to shape behavior. This is the world the witch trials helped create, not a world of superstition, a world of managed behavior, of acceptable expression, of quiet compliance rewarded as virtue. And it works, which is why it lasted, and why it still echoes. So as we slow this part down even further, let yourself sit with that discomfort gently. No accusations, no urgency, no demand for resolution, just observation. Observation that history does not end when events stop. It ends when patterns change, and patterns change slowly, sometimes too slowly to notice while living inside them. The women accused of witchcraft did not know they were part of a long story. They were just trying to survive. That might be the most human part of all. So let the voice soften again. Let the thoughts drift without needing answers. Part 11 does not conclude anything. It simply reminds us that what feels normal has a history, and that history is still breathing quietly behind us, not shouting, just close enough to be felt. And tonight, that awareness is enough.
All right, we continue. Same low light, same steady pace, nothing sudden, nothing sharp. Part 12 is long, deliberately so, because this is the part where history finally fades into something softer and more dangerous than denial. This is where remembering becomes optional and forgetting starts to feel like kindness. By this stage, the world no longer argues about witch trials. There is no debate, no urgency, no moral panic. The subject exists comfortably in the past, filed away under lessons learned. People believe they understand it, and that belief is exactly what allows the deeper patterns to survive untouched. When societies decide they have already learned from history, they stop listening to it. They stop asking what parts of it are still active, still breathing, still shaping behavior quietly without ceremony. Witch trials become stories about ignorance, about superstition, about a lack of science. That explanation is neat, reassuring, and incomplete. Because ignorance alone does not organize courts. Superstition alone does not maintain bureaucracy. Fear alone does not sustain decades of coordinated action. What sustained witch trials was consensus, and consensus is not exclusive to the past. After the trials ended, remembering became inconvenient. Families wanted distance, communities wanted peace, institutions wanted legitimacy. Memory complicated all three, so memory softened. Instead of specific women, people remembered abstract victims. Instead of neighbors, they remembered concepts. Instead of responsibility, they remembered tragedy. Tragedy has no culprit, and that made it easier to live with. Over time, witch trials were framed as collective mistakes. No one's fault in particular, everyone equally confused, everyone equally misled. This framing flattened reality, because not everyone had equal power, not everyone made decisions, not everyone survived. But equality of blame feels fair, and fairness feels comforting. So memory was edited, and edited memory became official. This process happens quietly, through education, through storytelling, through omission. Children learn dates, not dynamics. Outcomes, not incentives. Endings, not aftermaths. The women disappear again, this time politely. Another consequence of forgetting is that warning signs lose their context. When communities stop remembering why certain behaviors were dangerous, they keep the behaviors but forget the reasons. Be careful. Don't stand out. Avoid conflict. These rules remain, but their origins vanish. They stop feeling oppressive and start feeling practical, which makes them harder to question. This is how control survives without force. Another long effect of witch trials is how societies learned to frame vulnerability as risk. During trials, vulnerable women were accused not because they were powerful, but because they were exposed, poor, isolated, different. That logic persisted. Even now, those who lack protection are more closely monitored, more easily blamed, more quickly dismissed. Not because people are cruel, because systems are efficient. It is easier to manage those with fewer defenders. That lesson was learned early and well. Over time, compassion itself became conditional. Help was offered to those who behaved correctly, sympathy to those who suffered quietly, support to those who did not challenge the system providing it. Those who resisted were labeled ungrateful, difficult, suspicious. This echoes older judgments. A woman who did not repent during a witch trial was dangerous. A woman who does not comply today is problematic. Different language, same reaction. Another subtle inheritance is how societies learned to pathologize resistance. Women accused of witchcraft were often described as stubborn, defiant, uncooperative. These traits justified harsher treatment. After the trials, similar language persisted in different contexts. She's unstable, she's hostile, she's not rational. Resistance becomes evidence of flaw, and flaw becomes justification. This logic is circular and very effective. One of the quietest consequences of witch trials is how they reshaped emotional expression. Fear became acceptable, anger became dangerous, sadness became private.
Women learned to soften emotions, to translate them into acceptable forms. Concern instead of outrage, discomfort instead of anger, fatigue instead of protest. This emotional narrowing was not mandated, it was modeled, reinforced, rewarded, and it still shapes behavior. Another long shadow is how communities learned to value harmony over honesty. Witch trials thrived in environments where disagreement was dangerous, where consensus mattered more than truth. After the trials, open disagreement remained risky. Better to smooth things over, better to let it go, better not to reopen old wounds. Wounds were never allowed to heal properly. They were simply covered, and covered wounds still ache. History often praises societies for moving on, but moving on without reckoning leaves structures intact. It leaves power relations unchanged. It leaves the same people vulnerable. This is why the story feels endless, because it is. It is not about events, it is about habits. Habits of thought, habits of silence, habits of choosing comfort over clarity. Witch trials taught societies that discomfort is dangerous. Questioning disrupts, visibility provokes, difference destabilizes. So people learned to soften themselves down, to become less noticeable, less demanding, less present. And those who refused paid the price. That lesson did not expire. Another uncomfortable inheritance is how women learned to doubt their own perceptions. Accused women were told their memories were unreliable, their experiences imagined, their feelings exaggerated. That gaslighting did not end with the trials. Women still learn early that certainty invites challenge. Are you sure? Are you being sensitive? Maybe you misunderstood. Over time, this erodes confidence, and self-doubt is easier to manage than conviction, which is useful to systems that prefer compliance. This is not conspiracy, it is accumulation. Small lessons layered over centuries. One of the reasons witch trials remain fascinating is not because they are alien, it is because they are familiar. Strip away the language of demons and spells, and what remains is deeply recognizable. Fear of disruption, desire for order, punishment disguised as protection, and the belief that some people are more expendable than others. That belief never announces itself. It hides in policy, in norms, in expectations. Part 12 sits with that realization for a long time, long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to feel tired, because fatigue is part of the story too. The women accused of witchcraft were exhausted long before judgment, exhausted by suspicion, by isolation, by waiting. That exhaustion echoes forward. Silence is often not peace, it is fatigue, and fatigue looks like acceptance from the outside. So as we slow this part even further, allow the weight to remain without needing resolution. No fixing, no solving, no reassurance. Just the quiet understanding that forgetting is not neutral. It shapes what we tolerate, what we repeat, what we allow to happen quietly again. History does not punish forgetting, it simply waits. And when conditions align, it resumes. Not as fire, not as spectacle, but as routine. So let the voice lower, let the thoughts blur at the edges. Part 12 does not close the story. It shows how stories disappear, and how disappearance itself becomes a legacy. That is the final discomfort, and tonight, that is where we rest.
All right, we keep drifting. Same dim room, same slow voice that never quite lands anywhere sharp. Part 13 is long, wider than the last, because this is where the pattern stops feeling learned and starts feeling inevitable. This is where people stop saying, "This is how it ended up," and start saying, "This is just how things are." By this point in the story, no one remembers choosing these rules. They feel ancient, organic, almost biological, as if hierarchy grew the way trees do, as if silence evolved for survival, as if some people were always meant to be watched more closely than others. Nature becomes the explanation, and once something is labeled natural, questioning it feels foolish. After the witch trials faded into the background of history, societies did something very clever without fully realizing it. They transferred responsibility from systems to instincts. Instead of saying, "We learned to control behavior through fear," they said, "People are naturally suspicious." Instead of saying, "Women were punished for nonconformity," they said, "Women are naturally emotional." Instead of saying, "Power protects itself," they said, "That's just human nature." Human nature becomes a convenient shield. It absorbs blame, it ends discussion, it sounds wise, and it is very hard to argue with. This is one of the most enduring legacies of witch trials. Not fear, normalization. The idea that some dynamics are simply unavoidable. Witch trials train societies to see certain outcomes as expected. A woman who speaks too loudly will be disliked. A woman who challenges authority will face consequences. A woman who refuses to adapt will be isolated. These are not framed as punishments, they are framed as cause and effect, as if no one is responsible, as if gravity did it. And once harm feels inevitable, compassion becomes optional. Why intervene in something that is just the way things work? Another inheritance from witch trials is how communities learn to confuse discomfort with danger. During trials, discomfort around a woman's behavior was treated as evidence of threat. She made people uneasy, therefore she was unsafe. That logic persisted. Even now, discomfort is often treated as a warning sign rather than a cue for reflection. She makes people uncomfortable. He doesn't fit the culture. They're not a good match. No explanation required. Discomfort becomes self-validating, and people who cause it become problems to solve. Witch trials thrived on this reflex, and after they ended, the reflex remained. What changed was the justification. Another long shadow is how power learned to present itself as invisible. During witch trials, authority was loud, visible, declared. Judges wore robes, courts announced verdicts, punishment was public. Later systems learned that visible authority invites resistance, so power softened its voice. It embedded itself in procedures, in norms, in expectations. You are not being punished, you are being evaluated. You are not being silenced, you are being advised. You are not being excluded, you simply don't belong here. Belonging becomes conditional, and conditions are rarely spelled out. This makes compliance feel voluntary, which is far more effective than force. Another subtle legacy is how societies learned to treat neutrality as virtue. During witch trials, neutrality was impossible. Silence was interpreted as guilt or sympathy. Afterward, neutrality became the ideal. Don't take sides, stay objective, remain professional. On the surface, this looks like progress, but neutrality often favors existing power. Those harmed are asked to remain calm. Those benefiting are allowed to remain comfortable, and discomfort is framed as bias. This dynamic traces back to the trials, where women's emotional responses were used against them. Too angry meant dangerous, too calm meant deceptive. There was no safe tone. That remains true in quieter ways. Another inheritance is how societies learned to reward endurance instead of change. The women who survived accusation were praised not for resisting injustice, but for surviving it quietly. That model persists. Strength is framed as tolerance, resilience as silence, maturity as acceptance. Those who demand change are labeled immature, emotional, unrealistic. The system is not questioned, the individual is. This flips responsibility neatly. Witch trials taught societies that it is easier to adapt people than to adapt systems.
That lesson was absorbed deeply. Another long-term effect is how fear was rebranded as caution. During witch trials, fear was overt. People feared damnation, curses, chaos. Afterward, fear became subtler. Fear of reputation, fear of instability, fear of being seen as difficult. These fears are quieter, but no less effective. They keep people in line. And because they sound reasonable, they are rarely challenged. It's just being careful. It's just being realistic. It's just how the world works. This language drains urgency from injustice. Another uncomfortable legacy is how communities learn to forget selectively. They remember the trials as mistakes. They forget the social conditions that made them possible. They forget how eagerly neighbors participated, how quickly rumors spread, how little evidence was required. Forgetting these details preserves a comforting narrative. We would never do that. Except the mechanisms are still there, still available, still tempting. Part 13 lingers here longer than previous parts, because this is where denial becomes gentle, not aggressive, not defensive, just tired. People do not want to believe that are capable of repeating harm. They want to believe progress is permanent. That belief is understandable. It is also risky. Progress is not a destination, it is a practice, and practices can lapse. Witch trials did not happen because people were monsters. They happened because people were ordinary, because they wanted safety, because they wanted certainty, because they trusted authority, because they feared standing out. Those traits did not disappear. They were never meant to, which is why this story does not end. It only stretches thinner until it feels like background noise, until it feels like air. This is why the women accused of witchcraft matters so much, not because of how they died, but because of how quietly the world learned from their suffering, learned what worked, learned what could be repeated without calling it the same thing. Part 13 is not an accusation, it is an observation. That when harm is normalized, it stops feeling like harm. That when patterns repeat long enough, they stop being noticed. And that when something feels natural, it is rarely questioned. So we slow down here. We let the weight sit, not to provoke guilt, but to disrupt inevitability. Because the most dangerous idea is not superstition, it is inevitability. The belief that nothing else is possible, that this is how it has always been, that this is how it must be. History speaks otherwise, but history only speaks if we listen. And listening takes time. It takes patience. It takes willingness to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it, which is exactly what we have been doing. So, let the voice soften again. Let the room fade. Part 13 does not close the door. It reminds us that the door was never locked, only ignored. And tonight, that awareness lingers, quietly, like everything else in this story.
All right, we are still moving, slowly, gently, no sharp turns. If this feels like it could go on forever, that is kind of the point, because Part 9 is about how silence itself becomes inherited, how it settles in, how it starts feeling normal, even responsible. By this stage, long after the last official witch trial in many regions, people no longer talked about witches very much, at least not directly. The word itself became embarrassing, old-fashioned, a reminder of something people preferred to see as childish. But the habits remained. Communities did not dismantle them, they simply stopped explaining them. No one said women should keep their heads down because accusations once destroyed lives. They just said, it's better not to draw attention. No one said, speaking out can be dangerous. They said, be careful how that looks. No one said, power punishes unpredictability. They said, that's just how things are. And over time, these phrases hardened into wisdom, advice passed down, common sense, survival tips. This is how trauma disguises itself as tradition. Young girls learned early what kinds of behavior were praised: quietness, helpfulness, modesty, agreeableness.
They also learned, often without words, what kinds of behavior caused discomfort: anger, confidence, curiosity that went too far, knowledge that could not be neatly explained. No one needed to mention witches. The lesson had already been absorbed. Older women enforced these lessons too, not always cruelly, often protectively. They warned younger women to be careful, to avoid gossip, to avoid conflict, to avoid standing out. This was not betrayal, it was adaptation. They had seen what happened to women who became visible in the wrong way, and they wanted the next generation to survive. So silence was taught as safety. Another long effect of witch accusations was the way communities learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems: better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe, which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records. It operated socially, professionally, familially. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers. Not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety. And if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems: better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe,
which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records. It operated socially, professionally, familially. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers, not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety, and if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued to operate freely. A person did not need to be arrested to be destroyed. They just needed to be isolated. And isolation was easy to justify. She's difficult. He makes people uncomfortable. They don't fit. These phrases replaced incantations, and they worked just as well. Another subtle inheritance was how credibility became conditional. Women especially learned that being believed depended on performance. Too emotional meant unstable. Too calm meant suspicious. Too detailed meant rehearsed. Too vague meant evasive. There was always a reason not to believe, which meant many learned not to speak at all. Silence became proof of virtue. But silence is not neutral. It creates space for others to speak instead, and those voices often belonged to authority. This dynamic did not require courts or trials or records. It operated socially, professionally, familially. Quiet pressure replaced overt accusation, and because it was quieter, it felt more civilized. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that witch trial history offers, not that people were cruel, but that people were practical. They wanted stability, predictability, safety, and if sacrificing a few individuals achieved that, it was rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. That logic never fully went away. It just learned to wear softer language. Another long-term consequence was how societies learned to treat harm as vague and untraceable. When something went wrong, people felt it was safer not to ask too many questions. Who caused this? Why did this happen? Who benefits? These questions could destabilize the fragile peace. Better to accept misfortune as fate, or divine will, or bad luck. Witch trials thrived on this mindset, and after they ended, it persisted. Blame became abstract, responsibility diffuse, which meant systems rarely faced consequences. Instead, they quietly refined themselves. Legal reforms addressed surface problems, better standards of evidence, restrictions on torture, formal protections, all important, all necessary. But beneath that, social punishment continued